Cullan, and today Alexandra and Lucy and I are giving a presentation on Disease and Human Evolution by Dr. Ethne Barnes.
The main thesis of the book is that in order to understand the complex relationship between disease and humanity, it's crucial to understand how those respective species survived and evolved over time. Uh, Bacteria, viruses, protozoa, eradication of them is never going to be a reasonable healthcare goal because they're crucial for creating ecological equilibriums. Um, the main reason that diseases enter human species is because of changes in the environment, and new health issues arise with the progression of science, technology, and cross-cultural interactions. So we're going to take a closer look at all of these points.
So Dr. Barnes received her BSN and her master's from Wichita State. Then she went on to receive a PhD in anthropology from Arizona State. Since then, she's been an independent consultant and researcher in physical anthropology and paleopathology. She's interested in places around the world, and she's notable for her approaches in developmental defects in the human skeleton. She's also done research as an archaeologist in ancient Corinth and Greece.
So one of the key takeaways from this is the idea of an equilibrium. The relationships between infectious agents and human populations is one of a fluctuating equilibrium that is continuously changing based on disturbances in the environment and reactions to those changes. So it's an ongoing cycle. Over time, populations of hosts and microbes will eventually become tolerant of each other and create a stasis. The question becomes, what are the environmental disturbances and changes in human patterns that cause that equilibrium to fluctuate? How can we limit the health consequences of those inevitable fluctuations?
Throughout the book, we get different waves of globalization as well. Most notably is the expansion of international trade. And in the earlier days, there was the trade between East and West for goods, and this is where we really see the Black Death prevalent, and we have an intricate web of trade, rats, and plague, where we would really see the black rats follow man as they were traded across nations. Additionally, when we get into globalization in the New World, we see the need for human labor, which comes with the African slave trade, which Dr. Barnes calls the beginning of the process of germ globalization.
Yeah, and additionally, as we see our world progress, we have also noticed that new challenges arise. For example, as Dr. Barnes points out, technological innovation and cultural change equal new vulnerabilities. An example of this is rickets in the 18th century, when many children were forced and required to work in factories that produced and increased their quality of life and standard of living overall, but had the impact of depriving them of vitamin D and causing them severe bone deficiencies. Additionally, we see in the modern world a repeating cycle of bacterial and viral resistance to medication. So Dr. Barnes points out that superinfections can develop when they become resistant to our antibiotics, which were commonly used in the 1950s. And while antibiotics are important in protecting humans and ridding them of bacterial diseases, it is a constant battle where humans and we develop antibacterial medication, bacteria become resistant to that medication, and then we have to redevelop medication. So it's an ongoing cycle that goes back and forth.
So, one of the memorable aspects from this book for me has to be Dr. Barnes's use of archaeological evidence. This is a complex survey of medical history, which requires a lot of different sources. When you're writing about history, especially history of human evolution and the diseases, historical information from literary sources is necessary, but it is just as important, if not more important, to understand the physical archaeological evidence, where Dr. Barnes has a supreme skill as her experience as an archaeologist. So she seems to focus very well on secondary sources to explain the causes and treatments of diseases, but there are several instances where she appropriately employs archaeological evidence. One is determining possible location of diseases throughout time and place. That is hard to do in literary sources, as there can be different authors and whatnot. For example, she cites tuberculosis in northeastern Asia, I'm sorry, and the New World. Um, Additionally, you could track the development of civilizations. In the book, across all chapters, she talks about, and as we've talked about in lecture, we talk about that as civilizations develop and grow, so too do the diseases get stronger and more complex. So archaeological evidence shows that increasing population develops in an organized manner and so do diseases.
So one case study we wanted to look at was lice. They have a lot of evolutionary advantages. Adults can live up to 30 days and females can produce 5 to 10 eggs per day. So they're reproducing very quickly and they can survive on a host without having to move around. That's why we see them a lot in places like middle schools or grammar schools, where kids come into contact with each other very frequently. Different types of lice also adapt to different parts of hair, pubic hair, head hair. So they're able to adapt and evolve to fit their specific need. And the host's immune system has grown tolerant to these. So sometimes there can be infections, but the majority of the time, hosts are able to survive and thrive, even with the lice feeding off of them. So you might think that a really harsh virus or bacteria might be the easiest to survive, but at the end of the day, it's about creating that equilibrium of tolerance, and lice are able to accomplish that. They're also known as hitchhikers because they know no geographical boundaries. They're found everywhere from the Arctic Circle to the tropics, which is evidence, again, going back to the archaeological evidence, that they've been here since our earliest ancestors. So not only are they everywhere, but they've also been around a long, long time. We see ancient lice nits in mummy hair from ancient Egypt, South America, India, China. We have writings, archaeological data. Lice are everywhere. And we wanted to talk about this case study. It really stood out to us because so many of the diseases that were discussed in this book were really dependent on the environmental context, because that is how species evolve, is because of their environment. But lice have this interesting ability to evolve and survive regardless of the context in which they live.
Yeah, and zooming out, I thought it very interesting to analyze the growing level of government intervention that we've seen throughout history, because we know that as people come together, that is when they are susceptible to these diseases. But at the same time, then the government can step in and play a greater role. And Barnes details that throughout history, the level in combating these diseases that the government plays has increased over time. So, for example, in the 17 and 18 and 1900s, the government generally played a much lower, a much lesser role in fighting diseases and was more advisory, although they did have some quarantines. However, we see in the 1970s with President Ford attempting to create a vaccination campaign to make the whole country immune to the flu. And we can see this trend increasing over time, most notably with COVID in the past few years and the government imposing mass lockdowns and vaccination requirements.
So the question we present to each other and to you is, did this book change how you approach your own health? And for me, I think it asked me to lead a better life of caution in the changing environment. We never know how disease is going to affect ourselves or each other, and we have to remember that the things we do as a culture today will affect ourselves in the future.
I think it's really interesting that Alexandra talks about the future, and I think it's also important to look at the past, and this book made me think about that. At the end of the day, we have the same instincts, desires, to as our ancestors. So whether it's the creation of fire or the progression of industrialization, we're always going to be changing, and we can learn from our past because at the end of the day, we're the same species.
Yeah, and this this book really made me think of the day-to-day decisions that we make regarding our health, because our health is so easily influenced by things like diet and food and sleep and stress levels. And all of these are decisions that we can make to improve our body's ability to fight infection.
So overall, we wanted to touch on some broad themes that made this book really great. One of them was framing the entire book as a war. This extended metaphor allows Barnes to really explore the nuance of the issue and look at it from a lot of different perspectives, by portraying it as a war and using war terminology throughout the book.
Yeah, and overall, as a history of medicine survey, we give it a thumbs up and recommend it. She balances the heavy scientific aspects with historical notes and contextualization to connect all the overarching themes we've been talking about.
Yeah, and one point of criticism that I would have is that she uses a heavy amount of biological and anatomical terminology. Now, this is great for a specific audience that has pre-existing medical knowledge, but makes it less accessible to a more common reader. However, I thought overall the book was very engaging. She makes a good use of primary and secondary sources, and it uses many interesting examples. And overall, I would recommend this.
Thanks for watching. We're excited to hear what you think about our discussion questions, and we're excited to listen to yours too.
Thank you.